With the recent announcement of the Resident Evil 3 remake, the series is on its way to 25 installments, including spin-offs and remakes, across its 23-year lifetime. A good majority of the games over the years have become beloved classics, some even regarded among the best games of all time. However, other entries have fallen by the wayside, whether for their polarizing mechanics, odd design choices, or hardware limitations. While some of these games might not be the best in the series, we certainly believe that they are worth having a look at, if only to appreciate the novelty that each brings to the table. This is Serial Buck 64 for First Aid Spray, and this is 5 overlooked Resident Evil games. Resident Evil Survivor. Let's begin with the first ever spin-off in the series, Survivor. Released for the PS1 in the year 2000, and taking place shortly after the Raccoon City incident, the player is put in control of a man suffering from amnesia, stuck in the midst of another viral outbreak on Sheena Island, a private township owned and controlled by the Umbrella Corporation. The game is most notable for its departure from the traditional fixed camera perspective and pre-rendered backgrounds, instead opting for a first-person view with 3D environments, making it the first FPS in the series almost 17 years before the release of Resident Evil 7. Players are given a pistol with infinite ammo upon starting the game, but they are able to collect bigger, badder weapons as they progress. Granted, these do have limited ammo, so players must collect the ammo on their journey from both the environment and fallen enemies. Seems like Survivor didn't just beat RE7 to the punch or something, but also other titles too. One strange design choice made in Survivor is the fact that there are no save points in the game whatsoever, so players can only record their progress if they either die and decide not to continue, or upon completing the story. Even then, only inventory and files are saved, as opposed to actual progress. Still, the game is relatively simple and short compared to other titles, only taking a handful of hours to beat, and that's including all the relatively long loading times between door transitions, one of the largest criticisms leveled against the game, both then and now. The game's shortness is somewhat balanced by the ability to choose different paths along the journey, which in turn results in slightly different story beats and encountering different enemies. Although almost all of these are recycled from Resident Evil 2, Survivor does have a few of its own ideas, one of these being the sheer number of tyrants the player could be expected to fight. After all, Survivor is set on an island specifically designed to mass-produce them, which is still a rather unique setting. In this day and age, buying a legitimate copy of the game will cost a fair penny, so if you are interested in playing the game, it is far easier to run the game on an emulator. However, the dated tank controls may not be for everyone. Resident Evil Outbreak and Outbreak File 2. Resident Evil Outbreak was originally released in 2003 for the PS2, and the first Resident Evil game to include multiplayer through the use of the PS2's online network. A sequel, Outbreak File 2, was released the following year. Set during the Raccoon City incident, the game follows a ragtag group of survivors as they fight their way through multiple scenarios set throughout many different and unique locations in the city. Some are familiar locations visited in previous games, such as the RPD, the Underground Labs, and the Raccoon General Hospital, while other locations have never been explored before, such as the Apple Inn and the city's university, zoo, subway, and forest. The biggest highlight of these games is, of course, the multiplayer aspect. Picking between 8 different characters, each with their own unique abilities and equipment, each scenario allows up to 4 players to work together to fight monsters, solve puzzles, and find their way to the end, most often involving a boss fight of some sort. Another fascinating aspect of the game is the sheer quantity of endings that can be achieved. In the first Outbreak alone, each character has 4 unique endings depending on the actions performed in the final scenario, and while most of them are variants of the same ending, with different monologues, depending on what character is played, the highlights are the special endings that can only be achieved with specific pairs of characters choosing to stay behind in the city in the final scenario. Unfortunately, the official service for Outbreak was shut down in 2007 in the US and 2011 in Japan. However, in 2014, a group of dedicated fans managed to create a restoration project known as Outbreak Server Resurrection, which created new servers working with both original hardware and emulators. Even though it only works with the Japanese version of the game, there are fan translation patches which solve this issue, thankfully meaning that many other dedicated fans from all over the world can play the game in the way that it was intended to be played. Resident Evil Gaiden. Resident Evil Gaiden was an action-adventure game released for the Game Boy Color in 2001. The plot follows X-Stars member Barry Burton as he investigates the ocean liner SS Starlight in search of his fellow missing operative Leon S. Kennedy, whilst investigating claims of a new type of BOW. Behind closed doors, Capcom had previously attempted to port the original Resident Evil to Nintendo's handheld, and eventually were forced to cancel the project, unhappy with the results. Gaiden, however, was developed as a brand new title from the ground up, and the company's failed attempt at making the traditional RE style work on such a small screen certainly inspired them to take a new look at the series. Gaiden's gameplay switches between a top-down perspective for exploring environments and a first-person perspective for combat scenarios, where a reticle moves between the left and right of the screen, requiring players to attack when it lines up with the enemy. It's a fairly simple system, but it's entertaining in its own way, and for the time, the game looked pretty decent. If you compare it to the intended Resident Evil port, it's clear to see that Gaiden is an improvement because of how Capcom's developers came at it from a completely different mindset. The story also takes some interesting turns and twists, especially at the end of the game. However, subsequent titles in the series have ignored the events of Gaiden, making it non-canon. Unfortunately, most fans have also ignored it, and Gaiden gets essentially the Nickelback treatment among the RE series, constantly parroted as the absolute worst. That said, if you're watching this video and you've never actually tried it out for yourself, you should give it a shot for being bold enough to test the formula. Resident Evil Chronicles Collection. In 2007, Capcom released Resident Evil: The Umbrella Chronicles for the Nintendo Wii, and then followed it up with the DARKSIDE Chronicles in 2009. Eventually, both were released in the Resident Evil Chronicles HD Collection for the PS3 in 2012. Both games play as an on-rail shooter with no control over the character's movement, being forced to shoot enemies with a variety of weapons as they appear on screen. Why Chronicles though? Because they offer a selection of retelling of events from previous games, while also providing some accompanying original story. They're essentially a way to see classic stories from a new perspective, and applying a totally new action-focused gameplay slant on them. In Umbrella Chronicles, the events of the original Resident Evil, as well as Zero, are retold using original assets, but from a new viewpoint. There's also this thing based vaguely on Resident Evil 3, but because of the lack of 3D environments available for the title compared to the GameCube entries, it instead relies on assets from OUTBREAK, and so bears very little resemblance to the original. In contrast, DARKSIDE revisits the stories of Resident Evil 2 and Code Veronica in environments that consist of almost completely new assets. Perhaps more interesting are the scenarios that fill gaps in the series' history. Umbrella features Wesker clashing with Lisa Trevor on his escape from the Spencer Mansion, Ada Wong's escape from Raccoon City, and an additional story involving Chris and Jill raiding a Russian Umbrella facility in the hopes of ending Umbrella once and for all. Meanwhile, DARKSIDE Chronicles explains some of the history between Leon and RE4's Krauser as they investigate former drug lord Javier Hidalgo, thought to have connections to Umbrella. Resident Evil: Deadly Silence. We may be closing in on 25 years of Resident Evil at this stage, but to celebrate the game's first big anniversary, Capcom finally completed their goal of porting the original game to a Nintendo handheld. Deadly Silence is an enhanced port of the original 1996 game that was released on the Nintendo DS in 2006, made to commemorate the 10th anniversary of the series, and was also the first DS game to be rated M by the ESRB. The story elements from the original game are largely all the same, however, the differences in DS are in the gameplay. Firstly, thanks to the availability of the dual screens, the map is always displayed on the top screen with a real-time indicator of where the player is. Additionally, the game provides a new feature known as Rebirth Mode, which changes and increases the amount of enemies in the game, as well as adding brand new mini-games that make use of the peripherals on the DS, such as using the touchscreen to knife enemies, or blowing into the microphone to give CPR to Richard. Another big addition to the game was a local wireless multiplayer feature, supporting up to 4 players in 2 different modes. A cooperative mode where players share the same life bar and work together to defeat enemies, and a competitive mode where players hunt down enemies to achieve the most points. There are 9 different playable characters comprising of the majority of both STAR's Alpha and Bravo teams, each with different benefits, and also the novelty of being able to play as fan favourites. With re-releases of the remake taking precedence over the original, it just may be that Deadly Silence will remain the definitive version of the 1996 classic. And that's just a few overlooked Resident Evil games from the library of titles that Capcom has released over the years. Let us know what you thought of the video in the comments, and what games you think don't get the love they deserve. I've been Cerebuck64 for First Aid Spray, and until next time, see ya!